what's up? Welcome to another episode of Wassup Conversations. I'm your host, Hamidreza Nikofar, and today I have two amazing composers responsible for Season 3 of Star Trek Picard. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Barton and Frederik Wiedmann. Steven is the composer of some of the most revolutionary games in the history, such as Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, Titanfall, Apex Legends, and Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Frederick is the Emmy Award-winning composer of some of my favorite DC animations, such as Batman Hush, Reign of the Superman, Wonder Woman Bloodlines, and the Netflix's hit show, The Dragon Prince. In this episode, we talk about Steven and Frederick's success story, some of their great works, Star Trek, AI, and the way they make music. Before we go in, please make sure to subscribe to Wassup Conversations if you're enjoying the podcast. Star Trek Picard is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Make sure to check it out. Thank you very much. Let's go. Hello and welcome to Wassup Conversation, guys. It's so nice to have you both on the podcast, and congratulations on Season 3 of Star Trek Picard. The response is amazing, and this must be a monumental achievement for both of you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been one of those ones where we're still sort of taking it in, and it's really nice to actually be able to fully talk about it as well now. So, you know, because a lot of everything we've sort of talked about today we've had to sort of tiptoe up to things, and like, you know, one of the biggest things I think for this season has just been spoilers where you didn't even know you were spoiling something, and like we've just been trying to be so careful of that. Where, you know, and so how far? I have to ask, how far have you seen? Have you seen all the way?
I haven't got into it yet. Yeah.
Okay.
But we're gonna just no spoilers here.
No spoilers. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I always want to check, because it's just like tiptoeing towards it.
So wait, you haven't seen any episodes?
No, not yet.
Oh, so we can't spoil anything. All right. Well,
yeah, but the response, I'm following the heat for this, and the response is amazing, and especially seeing that people loving the music, and this is something new, and this is great. Congratulations for both of you guys.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, it's been an incredible experience actually with this, particularly, you know, where, you know, when you're taking over something of such sort of, you know, magnitude in terms of it's the legacy that's gone before. I know both of us have, you know, sort of there is a little bit of it being like, you know, someone saying, would you like to put 10 foot on the top of the Statue of Liberty?
Yeah.
By the way, don't screw it up. And you've got to make it, you know, it's got to look good. And you know, if you do screw it up, everyone's going to know about it forevermore. So yeah, there's definitely a little bit of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're a composer too, right?
Oh yeah. I'm making music for video games. Yeah.
So I think you very much understand that, you know, when you decide to become a film composer at your whatever early age that might be, I feel like Star Trek and Star Wars is sort of the thing that you would consider, you know, now you've made it. Like this is as good as it gets. Once you've reached that status of, for me, I mean, I've listened to this music for, you know, the past 30 years. Religiously, and then finally being able to actually work on it, it's like, wow, I can't believe that just happened, you know. So it's a milestone. I don't think quite sums it up. It's a lot more than that. It's an amazing fulfillment of a decades long dream.
Yeah. So we'll talk about Star Trek, but this is the routine of the podcast. We usually start from the past, but I'm going to do something different here. Before we go deep, I'd like to ask both of you a very psychological question. With this question, we'll be able to understand the style and the character of the music of each of you make. And also, it'll be a reflection of your own character as well. So, if each of you were supposed to make music for a biographical movie about the other one, what kind of approach and style do you think the other person would have had? It sounds complicated, but let's start with Frederick. So, if there was a movie about your life, and Steven was the composer of that movie, what do you think the score would have sounded like?
That's a very good question.
Wow.
That's a question for you too, but
yeah, you know, I think Steven and I need to hang out more and have beers and actually expose our deepest truths to one another to fully answer this question. Because on the surface, we both seem like very sane people, but I think
I don't know how much it applies.
Yeah. Well, I think, I have to be honest, my life has been pretty smooth. Should Stephen answer this, or should I say what I would like Stephen to do on my score?
What would you think that he would do for your movie?
I think it'd be a pretty mellow, dramatic score. Not melodramatic, but mellow and dramatic. With a lot of major chords. Because, quite frankly, I've had a pretty good youth.
Yeah. I can relate.
Great college years. I have a wonderful family with a wife that I love and 2 wonderful kids here in LA. So, it's been great. Yes, there's ups and downs like there is for everyone. But I think for the majority of it, the theme would definitely be in a major key. And the instrumentation, that maybe, the earlier years, there's a little bit more punk rock and garage band stuff and grunge. And then it transitions to a little bit more of Portishead and Massive Attack, and then it becomes maybe more classical in my 40s. Something like that.
Yeah. Is he right, Stephen? Would that be an approach?
I think so. I think Freddie's very so. Like, I think he's a very expressive person. I think he's someone who's very, it's very much he's got a very good connection between his heart and his head musically, and it's like, so he's one of those people where I think it would be, I think it would be an enjoyable score. I don't think it would be a sort of ambient noise or something. I think it's one you could take off the shelf and listen to, and oh wow, vice versa. Wow, I have to think about this. I think it would be. He would have to immerse himself. Freddie would have to immerse himself in English music of the early 20th century. I don't know the degree to which he may have already done that.
Very little,
but because there's definitely a musical past. He would have to immerse himself in choral music because that's very much part of my past and present, but past a lot. And I think very sort of. I think there's a sort of an English melancholy thing with me, which is, sort of lesser known composers like Herbert Howells and, Peter Warlock and, and there's a little bit of a, sort of, I think a sort of a dark, edgy side as well. I'm known for occasionally, like not losing my temper, but like, just, like, if I believe in something, I can fight tooth and nail for it, as anyone who knows me well will happily say. But yeah, I would hope generally. I mean, it's been a crazy ride getting to where I got to. In terms of I worked with Harry Grayson Williams when I was 19. I moved to LA when I was just about 3 weeks shy of my 19th birthday to work for Harry. And I went to the University of Gregson Williams because I very much did. So it was very much being thrown into the deep end and trying not to drown. In terms of sort of batting on big stuff very 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 quickly in terms of what one was being asked to do, and it was there wasn't really time to screw it up. You had to get it right. But with also, I had the greatest of mentors. So I would hope it would be a thrilling and sometimes energetic, but ultimately fulfilling musical journey.
I feel like Stephen he's very articulate and very sophisticated with his words. So I would envision there being some kind of a jazz component in it too.
Wow,
you're actually, I don't know if
some improvisation.
You're actually dead on there. Actually, funnily enough, because I was a jazz pianist. I don't know if I've ever, and that's not very widely known. So that's pretty dead on the money.
I picked up on that.
Yeah. Great. That was fun. So we kind of know emotionally how you guys feel about each other and how we kind of have a kind of headspace about your characters. Now, let's time travel to the past, starting with you, Stephen. Tell us about your childhood, growing up with music, and how did you get into making music for movies and games? Tell us about the success story.
Wow. So, I played piano when I was very young. Through a neighbor like 2 doors down from us was a piano teacher. And I think I was sort of tinkering on their piano, like when I was about age 4 or 5, probably just mashing keys up and down. But and the person who he was a concert pianist, and he noticed I was like sort of picking out tunes. It was probably like Twinkle Little Star or something, but I was like trying to I wasn't just like hammering it like something, but I was actually like going, it's kind of. So I had piano lessons when I was young, and then when I was 8, I was actually a singer. I was a professional singer from the age of 8 till about the age of 13. And got to do some incredible things off that. I mean, was one of the at the time one of the finest choirs in the world. It was with the choir of Winchester Cathedral, and it was like we got to tour we did stuff with like Andrew Lloyd Webber. We did stuff like later with the I mean, we all over the world, went to America twice, Australia, performed at Sydney Opera House when I was like 10. So I got this incredible sort of versing in professional music at a very, very young age, and recording sessions and things like that. And then I went to a specialist music school in Somerset as a pianist, actually, because that was my main instrument. I quickly got to that, and it was sort of 13, 14, and realized, there were kids bashing out Rachmaninoff 3 in very respectable ways, and I was like, not going to be a pianist, because kind of that world, you kind of have to be basically there by the time you're about 14. Otherwise, it's not really going to happen. I mean, it does occasionally, but it's very unlikely. It's sort of like the world of like chess or something. You kind of have to be really, really good. And even then, it's like by no means guaranteed, and it's tough business. And I kind of just didn't want to sit for another 5 years or 10 years or however many years in a practice room on my own. So I got into like music technology. And I very much lucked out at the time that I was at the school that they'd gotten a government grant to sort of have a bunch of recording equipment and a few doors, and they had Logic and some stuff set up, but they really didn't have anyone to use it. I mean, they had like a teacher who like was the person who used it, but nobody had really figured any of the gear out. They bought like a Yamaha O2R or something, but literally nobody knew how to use any of it. So I got the manual, sat through it, and just kind of taught myself how to use some of this gear, and kind of fell into loving doing that, and loving sequencing, and loving how writing music with computers and things like that, and as well as being on this very sort of classical music program where officially I was supposed to be sort of playing classical piano repertoire, and I also fell into jazz at the same time. I played a lot of that, so I basically went to a specialist music school and did everything but the thing I was supposed to be doing, and sort of coasted by on everything else, and much to the annoyance of probably my teachers or some of them, and then left that, and then a mutual friend introduced me to Harry Gregson Williams, who at the time was working on just coming in to do Sinbad. And so he basically, Harry was like, well, do you want to come to LA and, for a couple of weeks? And I met him at Abbey Road, and I was just like, what? Blown away by it. He was in the middle of recording his score for Veronica Guerin, which also was like, I walked in on him recording this insane cue at the end of Veronica Guerin. I'm just like, holy crap. This is
electric violin.
Yeah. And then the cue with the boy at the end with the singer, which is just one of the most heartbreaking cues, and it's just like they were recording the strings for it, and so I was just like, but I very much got the bug for it. I was like, this is really cool. So I basically ended up falling backwards into something I kind of was interested already, and then worked for Harry for about 9 years, and learned everything from him, and he basically taught me really everything I know, other than sort of the stuff I'd already learned about sort of kind of the professional music world and about orchestras from when I was a kid. And so, that was, and I'm still here, still doing it. So that's the potted history of me.
That was great. That's very inspiring. So, how about you, Frederick? How did you start? How your childhood was like?
So I started playing violin when I was 6 because I had a huge crush on Anne-Sophie Mutter, who was, still is a fabulous violin player, a German violinist. And she was basically the only reason why I wanted to do this. It was kind of strange, but my parents said, fine, here's the violin. So I practiced it, more or less. Didn't ever get really good at it. And then my teenage years came around, and it was no longer cool to walk around with a violin case and a skateboard on the other hand, with the baggy pants under your under your butt and all that. So I needed to learn rock guitar because I was really into Green Day, Offspring, Nirvana, all that stuff. So my parents were like, here's a guitar, here's guitar lessons. And if you know guitar you get to a place where you can basically play every song imaginable, right? Once you know the main chord that you can move up and down the fretboard, you're set. You can play everything you want. So I got there pretty quick. And within a year, I asked my guitar teacher, so what else can you teach me besides the rock stuff? And he's like, well, I'm a jazz guitar player, so I can show you some of that. And then he started opening theory books. And I think a lot of people would be turned off by that part of music, like my kids especially. What are you showing me? But it completely blew my mind, suddenly understanding harmonies and analyzing them from a jazz perspective, which is a little bit different than traditional harmony, which I didn't know back then either. This is when I was 14, perhaps. So I started to devour jazz harmony books as a 14-year-old, super geeky. And I got so much more interested in that than actual playing. I still study jazz guitar and I played it, but I was never great at it. And to this day, don't ever put me on a stage with it because it's going to be awful. And so, yeah, I got so hooked on the intellectual side of music and what it all means and what it all, like, there's so much in there that directly relates to composition in my opinion. So I think that's when that switch flipped for me. On top of that, I was already madly in love with film music. I had, all these soundtracks that I had gathered from odd places in my little town in Germany, because it was not easy to get them back then. You had to go find them physically in a store. You couldn't download anything, or it was kind of difficult. So I had an obscure selection of soundtracks from, all over the place, including one Star Trek compilation album. And I think that's when it kind of clicked for me that this is what I need to do. And then on top of that, I got to meet the neighbor of one of my girlfriends back then. His name is Nick Reich. He's a German composer. And he actually was a film composer. And I was, I think, 17. And he had a little studio and he was working very actively for a very popular German TV channel on this action show. So I just hung out with him all the time, just on the couch, just watching him work. And that's when I realized, okay, this is definitely what I need to do. And then I went to Berklee College of Music to study after living in Bristol for a year. And during my year in Bristol, because this was back when German boys had to do military service or social service, mandatory after high school. So I did my social service in England, taking care of disabled children. And I spent the entire year studying Berklee books, music theory and ear training. So by the time I got there, I skipped over the whole core music program, I did that mostly for my dad because, he was like, dude, you're German. You could study anywhere you want for free. And you're asking me to pay for a film music degree in Boston for an absurd amount of money. Like, what are you doing? It was very abstract to them because they're not musicians and, they don't know anybody who does film music composition. So for me to come up and say, hey, it's going to cost you $10,000 per semester was like, what are we doing? So anyway, I had to kind of prove to him how dedicated I was to this. So that's why I did all this advanced study stuff and got my degree in 6 semesters and got out of there and went to LA and started working for John Frizzell, another very established composer who did Alien Resurrection, The Reaping, Beavis and Butthead, Office Space. And,
I love that score. The Beavis and Butthead score. There's one of my favorite cues of all time. It's just like pizzicato strings, but it's called Beavis the Sperm, and it's hilarious.
I remember that one. Yeah, I put that on demos a lot when I was working for him. It was like that was a good comment.
It was only 20 seconds long. It was just one of the funniest cues. Anyway, I digress.
No, but it's true. He's while being a very versatile composer who works in all sorts of different genres, he was also very busy at the time when I was working for him. There was always a couple shows, movies happening and recording in LA, recording in London. So I think just like for Steven, it was being in the trenches with someone like this. And I had the privilege to be the only assistant. So I was like doing everything, besides the composing. And I did that for 3 or 4 years, every single day. And by the time you're done with that, you're like, okay, I totally know how this works now. Yeah. And then when John helped me to get my first feature film by making a phone call to Joel Silver of all people, the rest is history. Because I was basically ready, prepared to take on anything because I had seen him go through so many scores and TV shows that I was hands-on involved with. And you can't learn the craft better than in a situation like this. I think no college can really prepare you for that. Like simply being in a room when these people are having a show and tell, and they're getting cues shut down by executive producers, how they handle that kind of rejection in such a high pressure situation is just gold. I mean, that if you're able to absorb things like this, as a fly on the wall, I think that's the most valuable ththing you can do. So little side advice for aspiring composers: if you can assist somebody, do it, because this is the best way for you to learn. Then I ended up just jobs kept snowballing from my first movie into the next, and
and here you are.
Been interesting.
Those two kids going back in time and telling them, "Hey, one day you're gonna compose for Star Trek."
Star Trek. Yeah, I would have.
How
told
crazy
you
is that?
insane.
That's great.
I would have not believed you. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, coming to present time now, Star Trek. How did this project happen, and how did you approach making music for such an important pop culture phenomenon?
Well, initially it started because years ago, I think it's like, how many years ago now? It's about 5 years ago, maybe. So I got a very random Twitter message out of the blue. Actually, one of those things where you sort of, social media can be the bane of all evils, and then like just occasionally it can be amazing. I got a Twitter message from Terry Metalis, who's the showrunner of 12 Monkeys at the time, and he was and it was a show I was aware of because I'd actually watched it, and it was one of those ones where someone sort of messages you and go like, "Oh, I love your show," and you sort of like, "Oh, does that look really goofy?" Because like what is that? But I had actually watched the show because I was a big fan of the Terry Gilliam source material and Le Jeté, the original thing that it was all based on, so I sort of said, "Hey, how's it going? What's that?" And he was like, "I'm in Toronto shooting the 3rd season of my show, and I have a composer board, and it's not going very well, and I'm thinking I need to change direction. And basically, I'm in Toronto, like it's freezing cold. It was like really cold. It was like winter or something, and it was it was freezing cold, and he was basically in a hotel room, I think slightly miserable because of the weather, and was sort of like basically sitting and playing video games all day because he's a big gamer. He plays most things, and he's like he was playing Titanfall 2, which I'd done the music for, and so he's like, and I want my show to sound like Titanfall 2, and I'm like, wow, okay, cool, and then he's like, yeah, but I don't really know if I can. I don't know if I can make it happen, or I'm going to sort of persist a bit more. And I was like, oh, great, okay, then but definitely reach out. And then about like 2 weeks later, I get a message from him saying, "Can you meet me for lunch at Paramount tomorrow?" And I'm like, yes, of course. And it was really funny because I had just sort of gotten to a hiatus on something where literally it was just one of those really crazy timing things where it worked out, and I was doing something for Respawn at the time. I think I even had my studio at Respawn, and I still have a space there, but I had my studio there.
Was it the time that you were working on Star Wars?
No, Star Wars hadn't quite started.
That, right?
Yeah, it was after. Wow. So this was before Jedi, I think, originally. Yeah. I'd have to go and check the timeline. I think so. It was sort of in the lull after Titanfall 2, and I was working on a few things at the time.
Yeah.
I was working on a terrific little Amazon series called Nico, and a few other things. And so anyway, so he pops up and he's like, yeah, can you come meet me for lunch? And I'm like, sure. And he basically said, okay, I get for lunch, and he's like, we hit it off immediately. Like had ton of like sort of very shared sort of things in our past, and one of them being a love of Star Trek, and also similar sort of stuff of like various 80s movies and 90s movies and things like that. He's a big Back to the Future fan and many other things. So and he said like, okay, well would you be available to score my series? And I'm like, right, you like starting now? And he's like, yeah, starting like tonight. And by the way, the first dub's in a week. And I think there's like 40 minutes of music in the first episode. Can you just start tonight?
And it's Star Trek. It's not just like anything.
Well, yeah. Oh no. So this was 12 Monkeys originally. So Star Trek has some similar sort of things, but it was like so 12 Monkeys. He's literally like can you start tonight and he basically I got the first episode and they kept a few bits of things that had been done, but he's like you really need to redo this whole thing. And so I just basically worked like a madman for then following, and that show was then constant because we were so late on it. It was constantly behind. and we wwere constantly chasing the dub. And we had a very, very, very patient dubbing engineers who would literally, whatever I'd finished, they would dub. And I would play it to Terry. Terry would be like, okay, great, send it to that. And it was literally just this feeding pipeline of music. So we did that. We did season 4, and throughout season 4, we were talking a little bit about Star Trek, because it was always something that he worked on Star Trek Voyager, and he worked on Star Trek Enterprise. So he was someone who had been tipped to take over the reins of this thing, and even as earlier than when he did. I mean, it was always a name that was sort of floated, and he eventually he gets the keys to the car in season 3, and so that at that point, he sort of laid out his ideas, and we basically, February last year just started cracking into it, and he'd shot sort of 4 episodes or so by that point, and then so that was the sort of the crazy saga of how it came about. But yeah, he's a very unusual director in the sense that he's incredibly musical, and Freddie and we've told a few people the story. I mean, like the soundtrack album of this thing, he cut it. He actually cut the soundtrack album. Like we literally went to be, we got an email from Blake Shaw one evening saying, hey, we need the soundtrack album, but we should start discussing it. And the following morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, we both get an email saying, hey, here's my idea. And literally that's the album. That's verbatim what he did. Titles, lengths, exact cues, everything. He's that kind. And it's like, a very different, there are very few directors like that. I'm sure you're aware. Yeah, it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. So how about you, Frederick? How did you get in on this?
Well, my 12 Monkeys in Steven's case would have been Star Trek, in a similar sense that Terry basically called me up, or my agent for that matter, and it was similar. It was like, we need somebody to help on these upcoming episodes, and you need to start tonight. It's kind of the same thing. Wow. Yeah, Terry likes to call people like that and then have them going immediately, which is great.
Right.
Yeah, because it's it's Terry calling. So of course, what do? You drop everything and you do it, because it's amazing. So basically what had happened is the show was just so ambitious in terms of what they were trying to do, in a sense,
lunacy, I think some people would call it.
It is such a labor of love, start to finish, and they didn't want to compromise with the music in any part, because they hadn't been doing any compromises anywhere else. And while in a lot of TV shows you end up tracking cues from previous episodes and kind of giving you a head start with existing music, in this case everything just had to be composed to really give it the love and attention it deserves and to do the scenes justice. And it's just too much for one person to do, especially given we have recording sessions. It's not like you finish it in the computer and that's the end of the story. You have to orchestrate the whole thing, prep everything, put it on the stands. The whole process is just extremely complex. So when they needed an extra hand to halfway through the season, when Terry called me, they were looking for somebody who can blend in with what Steven had already set up, because he was already in episode 6 at that point. And
I was dead.
Coincidentally, yeah.
Well, I was just I'd written like 4.5 hours of music in the space of under 3 months. And I was just exhausted. Absolutely, like physically exhausted, getting up at 4 a.m., driving to Santa Clarita to where the set was, and was just dead.
Like,
and we literally,
episode is like a movie.
And that's the thing, is like, you think an episode of TV and you sort of say to the studio, I don't know how to explain it, be like, look, like you have episodes of TV where, even episodes of the previous season, which were 38 minutes long, 39 minutes long, I think our shortest is 51. And once you multiply that by 10, you're looking, and then a finale that's over an hour long, you're looking at sort of, really, we were looking at 7 hours of music. And ordinarily what you do is you write 2 hours of music and chop it up. And that would be fine, except that didn't work here. I mean, there's no way you could have done that. No possible way you could have done that and it'd be any good. And so we were just like, okay, well, we have 2 solutions at that point. We either compromise in some way and we compromise the vision we had at the beginning of saying, like, let's treat this like a movie and score it all, or we get someone else to give us help it. Because and so what, mercifully, it was one of those sort of great moments where the editor pulled up the episode 7 and said, and because I was still buried in episode 6, which is vast episode, a huge orchestra, and it's all sort of Goldsmith and Hornery kind of stuff. It's not like, ambient drone here. It's like none of that works, any of it. So I was like, okay, well, and he's like, well, episode 7 is virtually all temped with Frederik Wiedmann. Can we call? So and as just happenstance, it was like you were available, and we managed to get hold of you, because I was like, we didn't have a plan B. I will happily tell you, we did not have a plan B. We did not know what to do.
I could have asked for more money now that
maybe we should. We were like, we have to be. You were like our second. No. I mean, we did, because it was just that thing of like, and just this thing of this importance of this what this represents to 37 years of television. And you're sort of like, we have to stick this landing, and we have to stay true to the vision of it. And at the end of the day, it's like, as when you get into post-production on most TV shows, the studio, it's not that they don't care, they do care, but they are also like, you got to get this done. It's like, but you've got to be finished, because like, we can't keep everyone in post-production on payroll for another 3 months just for the music department to do stuff. And so it worked out incredibly well. It was one of those sort of fortuitous things. Yeah, they really did, and it was just a really great moment where we're sort of like started to sort of hear cues in this episode, and I just literally, I think I got a first proper full night's sleep in probably at least 4 months, because I literally hadn't slept. I literally had not slept an 8-hour night of sleep, not once. I was working 7 days a week.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is interesting that it works out pretty well. So this project was a continuation of some amazing composers. Speaking of that, we're kind of continuing a project that has attached some big names attached to them. I have to mention that I'm a huge fan of Frederick's work on DC animations. We were talking just before you came in. Yeah, you've composed for Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and they're all such iconic characters with big names like John Williams, Hans Zimmer, Michael Giacchino, and so many more attached to them. So what's your process of approaching these well-established characters when people are expecting a certain sound for them?
Yeah, well, it's, for the DC stuff in particular, just to go there for a second, it was very different in Star Trek, because every time I did the DC project, whatever it was, Teen Titans, Justice League, Batman, Superman, the starting point is always a clean slate. We do not want any of the old themes. We do not want any of the old thematic material from any of the other versions of this particular character in here. I don't think there was ever a single case where that was asked for. It was always like, we don't want it to sound like the Zimmer Batman. We don't want it to sound like the Danny Elfman Batman. We need something unique, something new. That is basically our new 52 storyline that carries us through that. Because I did I think 14 of those movies, and they all kind of connect. If you've seen them all, it's basically one gigantic TV show cut up into 15, 16 little, hour and a half movies. So it was all original. So I would approach it basically like any other movie. You start a new theme, you come up with the themes, and for the villain, for the good guys, if there's multiple heroes, you have multiples, and once you're set with those, you're off to the races. And there's the oddballs, of course, like the comic book adaptations that fall outside the norm, that are sort of twisted ideas, like Superman Red Sun.
Yeah.
Where, Superman he crash landed in Russia, in Stalin era Russia, instead of America, and is working with Stalin in communist Russia.
Yeah.
That's the story. So of course the score is very Russian, and, Hunt for Red October-esque as much as it can. Or Gods and Monsters, where Batman is a vampire and Wonder Woman is responsible for massive genocide. There's those too, and they offer such an amazing opportunity to do something completely different, because it is different top to bottom. So Star Trek was different because we had this massive legacy of incredible tunes, at our disposal, and we were asked to use those in very particular, carefully curated moments that Terry picked. Basically, he had a very concrete idea on where things needed to go and where the nostalgia needed to be versus the new material. So it's a very different approach.
Yeah. So a question for Steven. Sir, your portfolio in video game industry is legendary. You have composed for one of the most revolutionary games in the history, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which was basically a rebirth for the franchise. Then you have Titanfall 1 and 2, easily top 5 of the best FPS games ever. Titanfall 2, God. And Apex Legends, which became the most successful game of Respawn, I guess. I'm very curious about your relationship with Infinity Ward and Respawn Entertainment, both founded by legendary Vince Zampella. Shout out to Vince. Hope to have him on the podcast one.
Yeah, it was really interesting because that originally all came about by, I think, something that the particularly a chap called Steve Fukuda, who was the game director on Modern Warfare, Modern Warfare, not Modern. I was about to say Modern Warfare 4, Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare.
Yeah.
Was, his thing was very much all about. I mean, he was sort of a number of jumps ahead of everyone on sort of on how the idea of the FPS genre was going to go and where it was headed. Because I remember the very first time I ever saw that game, I was working with Harry, and it was one of those ones where we'd worked on Metal Gear Solid as well, which Harry did. And,
wow.
So I'd seen sort of the process of Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3.
Oh my God.
And so we got this very random call, and Harry was buried on something. I forget what movie we were on, and it was sort of one of those ones where it was just very. I think it was probably a Tony Scott movie. It might have been Deja Vu. Might have been. It was around that sort of era, and he gets this call, and and at the time I'd sort of started to sort of potentially work with his agents about sort of branching off into things, and I remember having a very early meeting with them where they were like, well, do you want to do TV, or do you want to do video games, or like something? Well, and video games were still very much the third class citizen at that point.
Yeah.
It was very sort of like, okay, there's film and there's TV, and somewhere down here there's video games. But that's silly things you don't want it to be doing those. And I was actually like, no, actually, I really want to be doing video games. I love video games, and I don't really watch TV, which I still don't. I don't watch very much TV. And so yeah, anyway, so I got this call, and they said, and it was from, I forget who it was from. It wasn't it was someone, I think Golfin Schwartz at the time was like called in. It was like, and because it was video games, it was somebody very, very junior. I don't think it was even an agent. It was probably a PA or something. Who literally calls and goes, well, there's this thing, Call of Duty, and I just about dropped the phone. I was like, Call of Duty? I'd love, So I went for a meeting with Harry, actually, because basically then they were like, oh, well, Harry will do a theme for us, and then you do the game. And I was like, that's fantastic. And so we went for this meeting, and we were driving, and Harry was driving, and I was, in the passenger seat of his car, and he was like, so what is the, he's like, he played some Metal Gear and some things, but he's not really a gamer. He doesn't spend great time. So, I mean, his son plays games, video games, and very much likes, but he's never really sort of been that into them in terms of the actual playing them. I mean, he loves making them and working on them, but so I was explaining what it is. I'm like, it's all about Nazis and World War II, and it's going to be great, orchestral stuff. And we're chatting about, we literally get there. We walk into Infinity Ward's screening room. They had a wonderful screening room with lazy boy recliners and stuff like that. And I was sort of big screen. And I'm like, great, fantastic. Give us the Nazis. And what's the setup this time? What bit of World War II are we doing today? And they didn't say anything. They played the nuclear explosion sequence.
What the?
From start to finish. You literally booted up and played it in front of us. And I just remember just sitting there going, oh my God. Firstly, what? Secondly, wow, you've just killed your main character in your game, in a nuclear explosion. What the hell? It was so anathema to anything that I'd ever dealt with before. So yeah, that was, and then just have remained very, very close friends with Vince and all that team, and that team. And then obviously with Respawn, when they all split off, I was in the Respawn camp. I was very much not in the other camp. I was that way, and was very much sort of chatting with them as it was going on. And then a few years later, I got a very cryptic message saying, please come to this random office building in Van Nuys to see something. And they wouldn't even say what it was, and walked in, signed a stack of NDAs about this log. Wow. And then they were like, they showed me Titanfall. So that was then the beginning of that chapter, and obviously with Apex and everything since. So, but yeah, really just an amazing gift to be able to, work with that team. And the makeup is a lot of this change. I mean, a lot of the original people have moved on, but they have crazy exciting things too. Everything at Gravity Well, at Wildlight. There's like 5 really exciting X Respawn games coming out in the next 3 years. So that's really exciting. I mean, that's great stuff. So
yeah, and I can't wait for the new Star Wars Survivor. And crazy, within a year you have Star Trek and Star Wars.
Yeah, it's been a little schizophrenic. Yeah, it's been a little crazy.
All right.
I mean, mostly I've just had to make sure I say the right one at each time. But actually, I mean, it's funny enough.
Send the right file.
More differentiated than I would have thought. And, I mean, Freddie and I have chatted about this a little bit with, one or two people. And like, sort of, it's surprisingly, you get to really see the differences. And it's like actually not that schizophrenic. It's not, there's definitely, and there's such strong melodic material that, I mean, you never, I mean, unless you were very, very unlucky, you'd never accidentally put the Force theme in Star Trek. So
yeah. So let's talk about the toys you guys use. Let me put it this way, so the composers listening to this podcast benefit from this part. Question for Frederick: what are some plugins, libraries, techniques to make a score sound like a DC movie?
Well, I think, I always say that a sample library, you should consider that like an instrument that you need to practice. Because every sample library has its own strengths and weaknesses, right? Some are good at that. Some are good at that. Like this brass is good at staccato stuff. This brass has great legato patches. This brass has really good low trombones that, give you this nice oomph that you're always looking for. Same with the strings and percussion too. So I think when I was teaching at USC, some of the students, I always told them, like, really get under the hood of every single piece of your orchestral template and understand its strengths and weaknesses. And then if you're stuck with that, like if your final score will be a MIDI score, you work on the strengths, write for the strengths of them. And then you can have a solid sounding score. I think a lot of people make the mistake. They utilize their libraries and they sequence music that would sound great when it's done live, but in most cases, and often in most cases, it's not going to be live, and then it sounds synthy and MIDI and not real. So I think what I claim to have gotten better at is understanding what I can do to make it convincing, while still not compromising the music necessarily, but just working around those parameters to deliver something that sounds real and live without it ever raising the flag. Like I get texts asking me for things like, "Hey, this Dragon Prince cue was great. Where did you record it?" And I have to always tell them, "Well, not recorded, except for the flute." So, and I think that's so. My tools are probably like the same stuff everybody else has, but my understanding of it, I think, is different because I know what I use for what, and can therefore make a very convincing mock-up. It's messy, orchestrators hate it because you have like that staccato from that brass and that legato from that brass and the strings are all over the place, but it sounds good. And then, you have to clean it up for them in the end so that they can make a score out of it. But I think that is key, is having an understanding of what the library is really good at, using it for that. And then, obviously it helps if you're a good mixer too, and you can make a convincing MIDI mix stuff for something that sounds, so the electronic instruments do sound like an orchestra done in one cohesive room, even though the libraries were recorded all over the place in different places in the world.
Yeah.
And then, in terms of synths, there's always the same things that everybody has. I don't think I have anything out of the ordinary. Zebra, Zerum, Omnisphere is great because it's so, you can get so under the hood of it and modify things and build your own multis, which I like doing. I love Contact because I do a lot of my own sampling. So I found Contact for that extremely useful. Every project I've built something and it ends up in my like custom list of things. So there's a whole bunch of cool things in there now that I use over and over because they're just so cool. Yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, so same question for Steven. So what are some useful tools, plugins, or techniques that people want to make Star Wars movie?
Oh, well, so it's interesting.
There's a Star Wars movie.
I think the biggest thing for me is it's quite general, but it's I think people often, people tend to mix too bright, especially with samples. People have sort of an overestimation of generally speaking, I rarely hear. There's either too much sub bass specifically. I mean, sub bass is, I think, it's one of the very sort of things that is tricky. But actually, with that aside, generally people tend to mix bass light a little bit. I think because most people either have the bass turned up too high on their system, or mixing on some place that sort of has like standing waves sort of building up, and so you tend to hear sample mixes that sound very sort of bright, and also sometimes people get very sort of too happy with things like ozone and things like that, where they'll use sort of presets which always tend to be like slightly curving up on the top end, and so you end up with this very sort of like in your face, which is really good. It's like that Pepsi challenge thing. It's really good for like 3 seconds, like wow or something, but once actually you listen to it for any length of time, you're like, wow, it's too much. And it's like and really doesn't bear any resemblance to sort of kind of how things balance in a true more true sense of players in a room. So I think a bit of that, and I mean I've tended to sort of pare down now to the stuff that I can find with programming that is gets quick results, especially if, again, I think exactly as Fred is saying, if you know you're going to replace something, then you don't have to sit there all day like making it sound like the most realistic thing in the world. I think the thing I learned from Harry was very much a thing of, it's more important that something sounds good than something sounds sort of realistic. And I see people with like diagrams of like how the orchestra is laid out in a concert hall, and I want to be like, no, that's not how it's not even how you record an orchestra, really. There's a degree to which you do that, but you certainly don't program like that. That's not necessarily a good way to approach it. You can be informed by it, sure. I mean, there's nothing wrong with sort of the idea of like, well, I'm going to put violin 1 there, violin 2 there, or violin over here, violin 2, that sort of spatial sort of sense. But people get very sort of like, oh, I'm trying to sort of recreate the sound of like what it's like to stand and like conduct a symphony orchestra. And what's really funny is I've spent a lot of time doing research into spatial audio with Dolby and a couple of other companies, and BBC and Qualcomm, and it's like you can get a binaural dummy head, like literally the dummy head Neumann KU100 microphone, and stick it right in the conductor spot and really learn how rubbish that is a spot, and that's for record like specifically. And the reason why Decca trees are like quite high up is because if you bring them down to ear level, it sounds like garbage. I mean, it just doesn't work. And so there's the understanding of what most recordings are not reality. Reality is really pretty boring. What most good recordings are heightened sense of reality. It's almost impossible in most acoustics to find a single stereo pair place that sounds good. So sort of logically, we shouldn't even program like that. And it's more important to make something sound good than it is to make it sound realistic. Sort of literally realistic. Yeah. Because that doesn't really win you any prizes. And you can sit there with it all day long and say to a director, like, yeah, but the program is really realistic. I mean, if it doesn't sound any good, nobody will care. Yeah. And so Harry is very much someone who always like, people also always sit and ask him, he does a lot with sound choice. People say like, what EQ plugin do you use? I mean, Harry barely, I know it's not that he barely touches it, but he very rarely sort of doing the sort of like corrective, like little EQ, like getting obsessive, like I'm going to do a notch at this frequency. No, not in a million years. But his demos sound brilliant. His demos sound amazing because he just selects sounds. He's listening to what it sounds like, not what his sort of preconceived notion of like the double basses and the cellos and the this and the that. But he comes from a very strong classical background, so it has that naturally. But he fundamentally trusts in like the music first and foremost, and it's like it doesn't matter how brilliantly you polish something, if it doesn't have a good tune and doesn't make sense harmonically and doesn't sort of take you on a journey and like do something musically, like you can sit there mastering it till the cows come home. It's not going to be any better. And it's not going to speak to anyone, nor is it going to emote in a scene, nor is it going to give you anything in terms of sort of making someone want to hire you. And demos are what we ultimately sell our product with. It's not acceptable anymore to really sort of have anything other than a reasonably polished, and you don't have to go on a mind warp about it. It's like it can have rough edges and sort of fine like that if it gets a strong idea across, but people focus way too much on the sort of on that side of it sometimes. But I mean, in terms of tools I love, I mean, I've always been a Nuendo guy. We Cubase Nuendo. I mean, I work in Nuendo for the multi-channel stuff, but there's lots of amazing libraries out there, and I think some of the garbage we did demos on, on the old sort of Roland S760s and things like that, and you had 6 of them, and you'd have to reload them off the jazz disc and stuff like that. So we have amazing tools available to us now with phenomenal legato things. So you can get good results out of most things. I tend to favor, I love all the new Spitfire Abbey Road stuff. I think that sounds really good. It sounds really polished. I've had lots of that make the final. And I love the Strezov Afflata strings. I think are really nice. I'm very much a big believer in layering as well. I almost never have just one, unless it's like a solo woodwind, but if it's a string section, I'll almost always have some kind of layering going on. And I have patches pre-built with like this layered with that, with the mod wheel scaled and things like that, just to be able to do it at speed. But you can do, if you have any of these halfway decent libraries now, you can get a result that's sort of professionally acceptable. But by professionally acceptable, I mean in the sense of like, it sounds good, and someone who can play it won't run out of the room shrieking. But I think it's just avoiding that pitfall of being like, oh, I have to have every single thing to make it that. Freddie and I probably buy every single thing because we just do now. But it's in pursuit of that literal extra 1%. But the 99%, it's all slightly irrelevant. It's all about that 99%.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question real quick?
Sure.
I'm very curious.
Yes.
For Steven in particular, especially Star Wars, like when you're getting it all replaced, I imagine the Star Wars stuff is 100% organically live, right?
Yes.
Is there orchestra mute everything?
Yeah. So that one is like mostly because EA have been incredible and just allowed us to do these absurd sort of 8-hour 99 days.
It sounds like that too. When you listen to it, it's like it sounds like the full orchestra and nothing else. Like knowing that that's where you're going. How detailed are your mock-ups? Like because the Williams stuff is like,
detailed, and then pretty detailed for a very specific reason, which is that in most games now, certainly non-linear games. If you have a reasonably linear game that sort of has lots of cinematics and like even the gameplay stuff is fairly on rails and straight up and down, and you can get away with the implementation stuff sounding sort of rough. But now, because of like most game companies want to make a vertical slice and they want to have that be pretty polished, and then really go into implementation, and such that really at the end of the process, all you're doing is an asset swap. So it's literally mix for mix, and we'll sometimes even go to the level of like, we will master the demos to a specific like LU value or LKFS value. So it'll be like at this level, and then we'll actually take the final 7.1 mix and master it also as 6.0 if it's gameplay as well, because we get out of the center channel, but will master it to the same level. And theory, that means they can spend the rest of the time when they do the implementation mixing the game. And the other big thing is also because most of these projects, when they mix, they don't have time to mix the game properly. They almost always try and build it in, and that time gets eroded because audio is the last thing. So I think what you then allow them is to sort of mix as they go, because they can mix to your demo roughly, and they're obviously going to have to go in and tweak it. But that's really the reason why. So the demos there they're pretty detailed and pretty much up there.
It's cumbersome, man.
Yeah,
but with Williams stuff, like with all those dense lines,
exactly.
And runs, and
being non-linear and making that word non-linear, always reflecting to the player's choice is crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
But you were saying something about the making it sound good rather than making it sound realistic. That was something that I was talking about with my friend, that now that AI is advancing so much, surely you will make it sound as real as possible. But now the human element is important. That how different can you break the form, break the standard here? Because AI is following a pattern, basically, right? At least for now. But now it's the time to just kind of go like, oh, all right, make it different than that. So
I think so. I mean, there's a degree to which, you know, I'd be intrigued to see in which some of the sort of machine learning things can work with, you know, some to make certain aspects of the programming side of it easier. And I know certainly I'm really into like working with scripting to make things like, you know, a lot of the sort of very repetitive parts of the process easier. I think the interesting thing is though, you know, I think lots of people are sort of hopped on you know, mostly a lot of journalists writing for major newspapers have hopped on like, oh, yeah, it's going to write everyone off. And the interesting thing is like, we haven't, I'll believe it once people like pay tickets to go and see an AI generated song. You know, I believe it when people perform that, like, because I think there's actually it sort of, for me, it's like, I think it's going to be useful for our process. But what's really interesting about music in particular, firstly, is that almost all AI music is fundamentally not very good. And that we haven't had, like, I think it's not like the Chat GPT passing the bar exam, which is amazing. That's incredible. That's a wonderful thing. But music's, I mean, we have this wonderful thing, I think, in a part of it, which is it is fundamentally about sort of human to human connection. And the moment you sort of take that away, we have such an innate musical sense that it's so based in sort of primitive things, you know, the primitive banging, the caveman banging a stone on a wall kind of thing, and then sort of not just trying to make a tool, but going boom, boom, and, you know, the experience of rhythm and our connection of rhythm to, you know, our heartbeat and to the you know, very physiological things, is that I think we're safe for a while, basically.
But aren't you worried that in the future, like, all right, make a new Star Trek score sound like Frederick and Stephen? Aren't you worried about that?
What do you think, Freddie?
And it delivers flawlessly.
I am not worried about this either, for the main reason, like Stephen already said, like, music is such a human thing, and what all AI is doing is recycling existing things. It cannot create from an experience or your heart or your yearning for something or anything like that. It cannot. It can only listen to everything that's been created and then with a calculation take bits and pieces and put it together. So to me, I think that the big question that few people seem to ask right now is copyright infringement, right? Because it's basically what it's doing. It's taking pieces that exist already, that somebody is an author of, and is meshing them up together. So who's the author? And if it does infringe on something and it is being used in a public or commercial piece, whether it's a movie or a show or whatever, who gets sued? Who do you sue? It's a computer.
I have a very good you know, neighbor who's about a friend of ours who's about 3 doors down. He's a copyright attorney, and I've had long conversations over multiple glasses of wine with him about it. And I think that, you know, it's really interesting that I think his comment was that he's like, whereas with art, with visual art, there is there's an inherent ability to sort of, you know, it's like you don't need a painter. You can create a digital image very easily. The interesting thing about music is that even the best sort of, you know, I mean, the best sort of, let's say if you had a MIDI playback thing with just sort of automated kind of, you know, processes, like say the playback out of Sibelius, like basically programming without programming, where you haven't actually had a human sit and input it and play it, but just taking the score and transferring it to MIDI through some technique or using some kind of mathematical way of creating the music and then getting it into MIDI such that you could trigger instruments with it, is just a much more difficult function. And almost all of the decent sort of AI music that you've ever heard out there in the world has been played. If you go, oh, actually sounds pretty good, it's usually then been played by a bunch of humans. and usually helped and corrected in some way, shape, or form. And so it's interesting because it actually the music just doesn't have that quite same ability to just be produced by Button. We're nowhere near that. I mean, even the best sample libraries, you have to sit there for hours, like really finessing the programming to get something even close to sort of the realistic idea. So I think it's one of those ones where I think we're one jump from even getting something out of a computer that sort of sounds like pleasing in that sense from an automated process. It usually has to be mixed, it has to be polished, it has to be programmed with. So to me, I think it's just our music is that weird ephemeral art form that is so sort of, intangible in a way. And, sheet music is so much only a representation of what a performer can do with it. We're sort of one step removed from being able to do that. And I don't know that performers will. I don't see the London Symphony Orchestra or the LA Phil sort of programming AI music anytime soon, because I just don't think that will be something that they would ever do, kind of thing. So I think other than as a novelty of like, oh, we're going to program this, but so it maybe we have a wall, we have a moat to our particular musical castle. I hope so anyway.
Yeah, think about it this way: you're behind the deadline is coming, and you're like, "Hey, make this episode sound like me," and the computer just makes it for you, and you just go to tweak it and release it.
Well, actually, that's the thing. I think that what you will do is you'll see things like sort of automated, like news stories or like things like that, or kind of things like bits of content. But what's really interesting is that you're dealing with a marketplace now that is heavily saturated.
Yeah.
If we all have in our pockets a device pretty much that you can go and watch. If you want to watch Latvian television tomorrow, you probably can. You can probably pull up Latvian TV live in a matter of minutes. And so you have this weird kind of thing where we have like a complete saturation of content. And oddly enough, I mean, I had this, they had this thing that was like based off of like an Aaron Sorkin idea of this, the idea of when that happens, the only thing you can really sell is quality. Yeah. And because if something isn't any good, someone can just flip the channel and watch something else. So that's, I think to me, that's where another little sort of firewall that we have, which is and ultimately music is one of the cheapest ways that you can make something really high quality in terms of if you're making a TV show with the cost of one visual effects shot, or you can't call all the factors. A day of reshoots is 10 times what any music budget would be on anything, be it TV show, film, or anything. It's like that's so we have some sort of I think some firewalls that should keep us safe for a while, if not indefinitely.
Yeah, exactly. We're safe for now. All right. This is it. Thank you so much, guys. It's been an honor and joy talking to you, both of you. Your music and art have given soul and emotion to many beautiful stories, and forever we're all thankful for that. And I can't wait for your future projects, and thank you for doing this.
Oh, just a pleasure.